as the debate between a side that wants to emphasize sacredness and a side that wants to emphasize the sacred. So, I want to talk about this, but I want to talk about this in a way that reflects back on that. Why do I start here? I start here because, of course, I've argued that religio is exactly a psycho-existential. Very powerfully read this, though. Well, this has to do with modal, right? With your, like the being mode. It has to do with your modal existence. It has to do with transjectivity. It has to do with primordiality. You have to read this in a deeply Heideggerian sense, right? But that's what I mean. And psycho meaning, right, having to do with your cognitive processing, all the kinds of knowing, right? Your embodiment, your embeddedness. So reading psychological in also a very comprehensive way. But I'm clearly arguing that religio is on here. So first of all, I should start here because that's where I'm starting from. And I want to talk about sacredness as within a psycho-existential sense. And then if I've already done this, right, ground this in RR, relevance realization, then I'm going to make proposals about what this tells us about the kinds of constraints that are available to us in our metaphysical proposal. And I'm going to propose an alternative to this, which I imagine will be controversial, but I hope that the controversy will be constructive rather than merely adversarial. All right, so I'm going to start here. I'm trying to be honest with you. I'm trying to be clear about what I'm trying to do. I don't want to be shuffling any cards from the bottom of the deck here, right? I'm trying to be as upfront as I possibly can be. Of course, I'm not unbiased or any kind of magical claim like that, but I'm trying my best to put the machinery that I'm aware of using and that I'm deliberately putting into play out front so that we can talk about this as clearly and as honestly as possible. Okay. So let's talk about sacredness as a psycho-existential thing. And where I want to start, right, is in the machinery of the agent-arena relationship. And I want to bring back the work of Geertz, and we talked about the work of Brian Walsh, and we talked about this when we talked about domicide, and domicide as the loss of something. And this points to a very central feature of sacredness that is so central that it's so backgrounded that we can, I think, inappropriately trivialize it. But remember remember how disastrous domicide is. Remember what happens if you actually experience domicide. If I fling you into another culture and you experience deep culture shock, or I isolate you in solitary confinement, okay? So that deep loneliness, that deep homesickness, that deep cultural shock, that's domicide. And so part of sacredness, Geertz argues, right? Part of sacredness is to home the world. I understand why he puts it, but it's not homing the world, it's homing us and the world together, right? The world, we are homed into the world and the world homes around us, very much like Costa's atmospheric bubble. So this is the idea that one of the functions of sacredness is what Geertz calls a meta-meaning function. Now he talks about this in his work on religion, but he's definitely in the Schleiermacher side of things. So this is not appropriate for me to do it this way. And this is something that fits in with our argument very well. Geertz argues, and be careful here because people jump. He argues that religion isn't a system of meaning. Oh, no. Okay, wait. He thinks it's a system of meta-meaning. Right? So whatever distinct meaning systems we make. Here's a legal system, here's a moral system, here's a fashion system, right? Here's an entertainment system. We have all these meaning systems, but notice the argument that we've already made. Those are all dependent on the primordiality of the transjective relationship between the agent of the arena. If that relationship doesn't hold, none of those other systems can work, which is why if you go to another culture and you don't go through the participatory transformation, right? If you don't, and you're just experiencing culture shock, domicide, the agent-arena relationship isn't in place, then none of those other meaning systems can work for you. They'll be absurd. They won't make sense. That's what he means by it being a meta-meaning system. What it does, he argued that religion, I would argue, what the experience of sacredness is, because, again, the word religion fudges between, are we talking about the Schleiermachian sense, or are we talking about sort of the metaphysical referent? Okay, so remember, I'm pulling these apart to try and avoid that confusion. So, but what Geertz is talking about here is, right, that if you don't have that none of your individual meaning systems work. And religion, in the sense of the experience, the cultural and individual experience of sacredness, is what gives us the meta-meaning system that protects us from domicide. It protects us from the horrors and the absurdities of domicide. So one of the functions of sacredness, right, is the meta-meaning process of homing us against horror. Where horror would be to be overwhelmed by loneliness, it would be overwhelmed by homesickness, cultural shock, and a tremendous sense of alienation, absurdity, and anxiety. Okay? People that belong to religious communities or spiritual pathways are much more resilient in the face of the tragedies and horrors of life. That's a reliable finding. One of the ways in which, you have to seriously consider the other costs, but one of the ways in which you can improve your capacity to make your way through the world is to be committed to a spiritual community and a spiritual path. And presumably it also has a history behind it. It has institutions, etc., and that would make it more prototypically like a religion. Again, you know me by now. I'm not advocating for a nostalgic return to religion. I'm trying to point out, though, the functionality to, or identified solely with, the machinery of worldview attunement and homing us against horror. It's very plausible to me that this is a necessary feature of sacredness, but I do not think it is a sufficient feature. That the experience of the numinous is ultimately to experience the transgressive side of the sacredness, how it opens us up in wonder and awe and even takes us to the horizon of horror.